Thanks. So the advantage of going last is that some of the things I wanted to talk about have already been covered by my extremely intelligent colleagues, particularly Brett, who covered some of the same ground I wanted to cover, which is fine. I can go through that a little bit faster and then see if folks have any questions. So I start with the sort of basic observation, which was also mentioned, at least indirectly, by the previous two presenters, that sort of COVID hit as a crisis at a particularly difficult time for democracy. So since about 2010, we have been involved in what scholars refer to sometimes as a sort of period of democratic backsliding or autocratization. That is to say, we sort of reached a high point in 2010 in the number of democracies that existed somewhere around then. And in that period, over the last decade or so, we've seen more countries, sort of moving away from democracy than moving towards it. So this crisis hits at a time when democracy is already seen by many observers as being sort of somewhat imperiled, in a period of weakness, yada, yada, yada. Another way of kind of looking at this data just comes from the Bennett Institute at Cambridge University, is that satisfaction with democracy. This is different, of course, than the number of democracies or liberal democracies that exist, but satisfaction with democracy also sort of in decline over the past decades, and in particular, over the past decades. Now, you'll notice, of course, that this decline is particularly prevalent in the United States. I think this is important because trends sort of tend to go together. The only places, in fact, where you don't see significant declines in satisfaction with democracy, particularly in Europe, are in the sort of smaller European countries. And I think, again, for those who know things about responses to COVID, after effects of the COVID pandemic, again, Brett and the previous presenter kind of talked about this, it's not surprising that it's in these small European countries actually where things seem to have gone relatively well. And the most obvious manifestation of this dissatisfaction with democracy, particularly in the industrial world, is, as has already been mentioned, growing support for populist parties, right? Why? Because obviously support for populism feeds off dissatisfaction with democracy, dissatisfaction with the establishment, yada, yada, yada. So as Brett, sort of pointed out at the beginning of COVID, right, there were a lot of fears that the pandemic and the crisis would accelerate these negative trends, right, would further democratic backsliding, accelerate dissatisfaction with democracy, and more particularly, right, as Brett said, it would feed the rise of populism because populists, again, feed off dissatisfaction with democracy, fear, yada, yada, yada. But this is in fact not what happened, right? We saw some violations against democratic norms and procedures during the early parts of the pandemic, but those seem to have declined over time. So places that track this, VDEM and others, did not find, in fact, any broad trend towards leaders, populist or otherwise, using the pandemic to really further erode the foundations of democracy. We didn't see an acceleration of democratic backsliding or autocratization in Europe in particular. And again, no overall increase, general increase in support for populist parties in Europe. The big exception to this, of course, is, I would say, the US, where the quality or the health of democracy did continue to decline during the pandemic, and the populist part of the Republican Party continued to grow ever stronger to the point where, again, now it is the sort of dominant part or faction or tenor in the Republican Party. But so while the pandemic didn't produce the dramatic negative effects that some people feared, more democratic backsliding, a major boost to populism, it didn't really boost the fortunes of democracy either. Most particularly, dissatisfaction with democracy remains quite high. I would say that when looking for some things that the pandemic taught us or has revealed or has highlighted, two things kind of jumped out to me. And they're fairly common sense connections, but perhaps worth being reminded of. The first is that democratic satisfaction, satisfaction with democracy rather, is dependent on performance, right? How satisfied people are with democracy in general and with their leaders in particular depends on performance. And then the other connection that I think has been highlighted is how linked both satisfaction and performance are to this variable of trust. So let me start a little bit with performance, right? Now, democracy enjoys what political scientists refer to as systemic legitimacy. What does that mean? It means that democracy derives some legitimacy from the fact that people value it not merely for its performance or the outcomes it produces, but because they believe in its values, its tenets, its principles, and its goals, right? Democracy is important because people believe in political equality, because they believe that people have the right to choose their leaders and governments, because they believe that people have the right to have a voice in the future of their societies, right? So democracy has that, right? But performance matters, right? Performance matters a lot. Just as an aside, of course, contemporary dictatorships are much more dependent on performance legitimacy today than democracies are. There was a time in the past when certain dictatorships relied on ideology, on systemic legitimacy. During the early days of communism, for instance, surely there were people who believed in communism. Communist regimes promised to create a better, a more just world. Nobody believes that anymore. Dictatorships today, even relatively stable ones like the ones that exist in China and Russia, do not have that kind of systemic ideological legitimacy. They rely much more heavily on performance legitimacy, which is why, of course, for example, during the early stages of the pandemic, the Chinese regime was so desperate to cover up its initial mishandling of the pandemic, because its legitimacy largely depends on a narrative of it being more effective than its democratic counterparts. Okay, so going back to democracy, right? So democracies are not as subject to performance-based legitimacy as dictatorships are, but performance again matters, right? Over time, performance is indeed linked with democratic governments. When citizens view their leaders and governments as being responsive to their needs and demands, they tend to be more satisfied with them, right? That is not a surprise, but we saw that once again very clearly during the pandemic. Again, this is just a general chart taken from that same study done by the Future of Democracy research group at Cambridge University, right? They find very strong connections between levels of satisfaction with democracy and actual crises. That is to say, when things are going bad, right, and democratic leaders and governments seem unable or unwilling to deal with problems, satisfaction with democracy goes down, right? So during the Euro crisis, during the refugee crisis, yada, yada, yada. And this proved, again, I think Brett talked a little bit about this, true during the pandemic, right? Leaders that seem to react to the crisis decisively, clearly, effectively, rationally, so on, were generally rewarded, right? Satisfaction with democracy went up, and these leaders' personal, support also improved, right? We saw that in places like Germany, Merkel, Scandinavia, blah, 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 right? So then the question becomes, why were some leaders better able to respond to this crisis, or viewed by their populations as more responsive to the needs of their populations than others? And here, one thing that some folks have highlighted is the importance of trust, right? Now, again, obviously lots of things going on here, especially when we're dealing with perceptions of leader and government effectiveness. But, one study, for instance, these graphs are a little busy, but probably you can, or hopefully you can see the trend, right? One study recently published in the Lancet found that when citizens were more trusting both towards their government institutions and towards fellow citizens, right? Pandemic outcomes were better. Pandemic outcomes being things like, sort of number of deaths, number of people in hospitals, yada, yada, yada. Why? Well, I mean, we can pretty much guess why that is. In societies that are more trusting, people are more willing to comply with rules, mask wearing, social distancing. You had higher levels of vaccination, more willingness in general on the part of individual citizens to sacrifice for the common good, right? Because you trust politicians to be doing the right thing, because you trust your fellow citizens to do the same, right? So this trust has this kind of feedback effect that enables governments and leaders to do better, and in turn, that helps to build the kind of virtuous cycle that leads to better outcome, right? So again, this one study, for whatever it's worth, and again, these kinds of, sort of assessments are obviously, they're more precise than they probably should be, right? This one study found that if citizens of every nation trusted their government as much as the Danish do theirs, or had Danish do theirs, yeah, we estimate that there would have been 13% fewer coronavirus infections globally. If the same were true for interpersonal trust, the reduction would be even larger, of about 40%. Yeah. Now, again, notice here that the US is anomalous, right? Here, levels of trust are very low. Levels of trust have plummeted in the United States from their highs in the, early 1960s, when 4 out of 5 Americans reported trusting the federal government institutions. And now we are down to a pathetic, less than 1 in 5, right? And this unwillingness, or this inability to trust leaders, politicians, experts, government institutions, directly reflected, obviously in the way the pandemic played out in the United States, right? Which is to say, people very resistant to following rules, very suspicious of what leaders and experts said. The politicization of vaccines in the United States, obviously a tragic correlate of this as well. So let me just end with a few words about the contemporary situation. Right? I'm sure all of you read the news. Otherwise, why would you bother to come to a symposium like this, right? You know that there have been protests in places like Canada, Germany, France, and elsewhere. And to some degree, this is obviously a reflection of, what we might call pandemic fatigue, of people just being tired of dealing with COVID, and of governments not having clear plans for how to get out of this crisis, for what the end game for COVID should be. And again, studies show that the higher the levels of self-reported pandemic fatigue, sort of measured as the perceived subjective burden of dealing with the pandemic, the more people have grown dissatisfied with their governments and even with democracy itself. And so what I would say here is that even in places where governments were initially perceived to have handled the crisis relatively well, where compliance was high, places like Germany and Canada, for instance, I think what we're seeing now, toward 2 years or more into the pandemic, is that there's still, even in societies with relatively high levels of trust, relatively high levels of compliance, there is a lot of danger involved when restrictions on freedom go on for a very long time, right? So, whatever your politics are, whatever your view of the pandemic, these kinds of things had an obvious logic during the early stages of the pandemic. We didn't know exactly what was going on, and we didn't have vaccines. But over the long term, these kinds of restrictions on individual freedom can have very obvious, very serious negative political consequences. What we've seen in places like Canada is that they can trigger right-wing fears of restrictions on freedom, distrust of the authority, right? We've seen this to a much greater extent in the United States, obviously, where these right-wing attitudes and fears are much more prevalent, right? And again, you know, the most obvious and tragic consequence of this, right, is the distribution of vaccination rates in the United States between red and blue America, right? The larger the support for Trump, the less high are the vaccination rates, and the higher over the last year or so have been the death rates, right? This is tragic, right? This should not be something that's politicized, but it is, yeah? I also want to note, though, that these restrictions have had negative effects, not just on the right, where I think they're most obvious and dangerous, but also on the left. So this is one poll, and I would stress, and I think probably, again, anybody who's here recognizes that any particular poll should be taken with a grain of salt, right? Depends on how the questions are asked, it depends on the methodology, and it depends on who's doing the poll, right? However, for many of us living in left-wing bubbles, a lot of these attitudes will not be shocking to you, right? Numbers of Democratic voters that at this point, 2 years into the pandemic, are willing to support, go along with extremely severe, not just continued restrictions on freedom, but with punishment for people who disagree with them, I think we should all recognize is at the very least extremely problematic. And again, after 2 years of dealing with this in the United States, which is admittedly, as I've stressed, anomalous, I think we have to recognize, again, the dangers that are involved, even when governments, for legitimate reasons, take quite extreme measures, right? And so, you know, we don't want to end up in a situation, I think, where we are testing what the long-term implications of these kinds of government restrictions on freedom are for the health of democracy, for hardening views on the left, and of course, for further triggering, I would say, populist attitudes on the right and dissatisfaction with democracy overall. So, you know, at the end, hopefully, of this crisis, I think one thing that we should maybe as analysts or scholarly observers of politics want to turn our attention to, as we now know, as my previous colleagues have pointed out, you know, some of the impact of the crisis itself during the crisis on things like populism, you know, sort of the EU, whatever. But now, as we're reaching the end, I think our attention should turn to what some of the long-term consequences might be. And again, I'm concerned that in some places where we already had problems, most notably the United States, that you know, we may be seeing downstream effects on support for populist type movements and politicians, as well as for dissatisfaction with democracy overall. So I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berman, for the presentation. We have time for questions, comments. Dr. Milas?
I will try to make it sensible. I have a question about performance and dissatisfaction or satisfaction. You associated these two, but performance is related to expectation of the voters, of the people. If people have low expectations for a given performance, they may feel satisfied, whereas for the same performance, if they have high expectations, they will feel dissatisfied. For example, we have, I know, a leader in a country where half of the people believe that he is the best leader, and the other half of the people believe he is the worst leader ever, whereas the performance is given. So I think when we speak of dissatisfaction, we have to take performance. We have to take in consideration the expectation of the people. I don't know how we measure that, but only performance is not enough to explain phenomena, I think.
I absolutely agree with both of your points. One is, I think that, you know, measurement of things like performance is subjective in general, and as you said, sort of dependent on expectations. And in very polarized societies like the United States, obviously interpretations of performance are heavily filtered through a partisan lens. I absolutely agree with that. There's no doubt about it. I will say though that, if you look at the levels of satisfaction over time, the fact that there is a strong correlation at the very least between periods when we can obviously see crises, disturbances, whatever, Euro crisis, I mentioned the refugee crisis, when there are serious problems facing societies and people's sort of, concerns and expectations of governments being willing and able to deal with them go up, you see dissatisfaction when the perception is that hasn't happened. So look, I agree with you. And I also agree with you more generally that dissatisfaction with democracy is a very multifaceted thing. Just like I was not trying to suggest that trust alone could explain things like COVID outcomes. Absolutely not. There's lots of things going on there, but insofar as we're focused on the political aspects, right? Because that's what we're, sort of here to discuss, right? We're trying to figure out what sort of political factors influence things like, sort of ability to deal with COVID, ability to get through the crises with folks believing that their leaders and governments, were sort of doing the right thing, trust mattered. So yes, satisfaction is a multifaceted thing, multi-causal phenomenon. Things like performance are hard to nail down in any objective way and are themselves filtered through other things. But I think, we want to consider that, right? Democracy is not, I think the more general point I was trying to make, democracy is not dependent purely on performance-based legitimacy, right? But we do have to recognize over time, if citizens become increasingly convinced that leaders and governments are unwilling or unable to respond to their needs, right? Again, this is a common sense observation, but I think often one that's not taken seriously, then dissatisfaction is going to grow, right? That's almost, again, tautological. And I think that the perception that leaders and governments over time have become less responsive is something that we need to take very seriously.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Öztürk?
Thank you very much for your perfect presentation, Dr. Sherman. What I learned from your presentation is that there is the crisis of democracy right now. The rise of authoritarianism, populism, is because of our dissatisfaction with existing democratic performance. So, but on the other hand, in the long term, maybe we cannot expect much better solutions from populist discourse, or whatever its name. That means we need some new type of governance institutions, organizations, intermediation mechanism to increase the performance of our existing democratic orders. But what kind of intermediation mechanisms, alternative institutions can be thought so that our expectation from democratic governance might be fulfilled and populist demand would be taken under control, let me say?
So that's a huge question. Let me skirt by it a little bit by just correcting one thing that you said, or rather correcting how I view one thing that you said. I'm not suggesting that the entire phenomenon of democratic backsliding or autocratization can be only explained by levels of democratic dissatisfaction, or rather I would say that in sort of older democracies like those that exist in Western Europe and the United States, democratic dissatisfaction has different causes perhaps than in newer democracies, right? Because these different types of democracies are facing different kinds of challenges, right? So insofar as we're looking at older democracies, right, places like Western Europe and the United States, I would say there the connection between democratic dissatisfaction and populism is relatively strong, although getting back to the previous question, that perception of, or where that dissatisfaction comes from, again, is sort of subjective, right? But the question of representation perhaps is important here, right? What characterizes a lot of populist leaders, or rather a lot of populist voters, and Brett has done, lots of great research on this as well, right? Is this sense of dissatisfaction, this sense that the establishment, however you want to, sort of operationalize that, is not really responsive to them. And I'm not convinced that there's not something to that, right? Often the sort of solutions that these folks advocate are not ones that I think many of us would support, but their sense that their needs and demands have not been, sort of listened to or responded to. I think that's actually, valid for a lot of these folks over the last decade or two. And we can point to, obviously, a whole variety of problems from, sort of rising economic insecurity, growing inequality, the sense that societies are changing in demographic and cultural ways that these folks are not comfortable with. Again, I'm not suggesting these things they're correct about that, but it's the job of politicians and parties to kind of help people deal with change, right? To make that change easier for them to adjust to. And it's not clear to me that parties and politicians have really done a great job of that over the last sort of couple of decades. And so, the sort of simplistic response to your answer, again, in the West, or rather in older democracies, is that I do think that our parties and politicians have become somewhat out of whack. They have lost the ability to both understand and therefore respond to the needs of large numbers of voters. And a lot of these voters have just gotten fed up. So, again, a simplistic answer, but one that I think resonates with what democracy is all about, which is it's supposed to be about representation. It's supposed to be about people's voices being heard and responded to, at least those, that are legitimate. And I think that, we're in a period now when we're recognizing that there is a strong disconnect between what, a lot of voters think they're getting from their politicians and parties and what they believe they need.